to this session. It's been a great conference, I think, over the last couple of days, and looking forward to the remainder of today as a great opportunity to share some ideas. We'd like to start today by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're speaking to you from today, the Darumbal country, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We'd also like to acknowledge Sue Evans and Susie Harton from our ethics office here at CQ University. As we've mentioned, I'm Associate Professor Rob Stanton. I'm HREC Chair at CQ University, and I've been involved in our HREC committee for about 6 or 7 years now, and as Chair for the last 18 months. My colleague, Associate Professor Celeste Lawson, is Chair of Academic Board here at CQ University, and collectively we've got a really strong interest, a vested interest in academic integrity. So today we want to talk about how we resolved what may have been a little bit of a wicked problem of academics wanting to embed research activities in coursework units here at CQU. So for those that have been involved in the tertiary sector, particularly for a long period of time, you'll appreciate the history, I guess, that HRECs have in the sector, and also the challenges that we face. And as Gordon and Hudson yourself have alluded to already, you know, and I guess was highlighted yesterday in the presentation by Adrian Barnett, there are some challenges associated with the roles of HREC around lengthy reviews and time to communicate information back to researchers. And it sometimes feels, I guess, for researchers like the review process gets in the way of research. But I think, as you know, again, you've alluded to this morning, despite these potential critiques for what we'll refer to at least as traditional research, that is applications that are submitted to HRECs by research active academics or by research high degree students, for the most part, these existing processes serve the research community pretty well. And to give you, I guess, some background about our processes at CQ University, we just have one HREC that covers off on all of our disciplines. We have a fully constituted panel that tries to cover off as many disciplines as possible and as many of the research methodologies as possible. So we have monthly meetings where applications that don't meet the low to negligible risk criteria are assessed. But we also have quite a significant number of volunteer academics, again, that contribute their time to our low and negligible risk review or pathway. And we get through what we think is a fairly significant volume of work for a relatively small university. One of the things that's changed in recent years is the landscape of learning design. We've seen a lot more coursework qualifications that are really industry engaged, or they're in some way guided by industry or have some industry expectation or external accreditation, whereby there's a need to introduce research activities or evaluation activities or capstone research units or subjects, depending on the terminology that your institution might use, where students need to undertake some kind of, we'll loosely call it a research project, I guess. These are done in such a way that it well prepares graduates for work in the relevant industry, but it also helps transition them into research higher degree pathways, should they choose to go that way. This shift in learning design has been accompanied by a move to more authentic assessment. So assessment activities really being indicative of the kinds of things that graduates need to do. And the benefit for students is that they can see the link between the learning that they undertake in the classroom or the lab or elsewhere and the kinds of activities that they'll do upon graduation. So this is really important, we think, for graduate preparedness, but it's also important to institutions for graduate employments, institutional rankings, but also to address the increasing problem of student retention. There are some challenges, of course, with this, and that's really around the misalignment, if you like, of timelines for reviewing ethics applications that are associated with these undergraduate and sometimes Masters by Coursework research students. It's not typically a problem for most of the research activities that are undertaken by let's say research-based academics or even research high degree students, where the turnaround times arguably not always as urgent. But for single term coursework units where you have a 12 or 13 week period of time, if you like, for that particular unit to get ethics approval, recruit participants, undertake the research, there is a real challenge. There's a real issue for students. For example, our HREC meets once a month. So if, let's say, a project is intended to be submitted to the March meeting, it would need to be submitted early March to make the agenda in time so that reviewers have got enough time to assess that application. Term one for us starts in early March. So clearly students are not going to be able to prepare a really well-constructed, detailed, rigorous HREC application within that time. It's term one, week one almost for those students. So that timeline mismatch is a little bit of a problem. If it were reviewed, for example, at the April meeting, and it goes through the usual cycle of review and resubmit perhaps, or there's a need for more information or clarification, or worst case scenario is rejected, then by the time all of that process is done, your term is almost up and the research activity can't be undertaken. That's a problem for students. That's a problem for the unit coordinator or teacher within that unit. And it means those attributes around graduate preparedness just can't be met. Students, we try to encourage them to undertake their projects as a low risk activity. We've got an expedited low risk review appeal, but even then the turnaround time is around 14 days. So even then the timelines are getting pretty tight once you factor in resubmission, calls for more information, the rigorous review and so on. Complicating this even more is you've got unit coordinators or lecturers that are across perhaps multiple projects and multiple groups of students in addition to their own research activities, or where students propose to do something that needs to come to the full committee. So clearly we've got potentially a bit of a wicked problem. The whole process becomes very convoluted. It's unwieldy for students who have got little to no research experience prior to this. It exacerbates workload for students. It exacerbates stress and workload for academics. And the sum of this is disgruntled students, disillusioned academics, assessment processes where that authentic assessment, real world learning is difficult to achieve, and a risk of non-compliance with the national statement. And so, driven by this need to accommodate an increasing number of academics and courses that need to include research activities as part of their design, and of course a finite capacity for the HREC to provide timely review and commentary on an increasing number of projects, we needed to come up with a couple of solutions to address these, but maintain a rigorous process of review. We've got two proposed solutions. One is an ethics pre-approval by unit, which is initiated and led by the unit coordinator. And second, a more expedited coursework ethics application approval, which we assess on a case-by-case basis. So I'll pass over to my colleague to discuss the first solution, as this very much applies to the units and courses that Celeste teaches into.
So whilst I am the head of the academic board, I also teach into journalism and public relations. We have a unit that involves the students interviewing or learning the process of interviewing as they would when they become a journalist. And so it fits really nicely into this first technique, the unit pre-approval. The pre-approval process works for units where the assessments can be pre-approved en bloc. So it doesn't matter how many students are in the unit, we can pre-approve the unit and the assessment within that unit. If there's any change to the assessment, then the unit coordinator is responsible for updating the ethics review and the ethics process of that unit. And the expectation is that the unit coordinator will oversee the process that the students undertake to make sure that they adhere to the HREC conditions of approval. The example that I'm been involved with is the undergraduate journalism unit. So these students are second-year students studying journalism, where they learn how to conduct an interview. The assessment item is that the students go out, speak to a real person, conduct an interview, and write a hypothetical news article based on that interview. The students learn about consent. They learn about developing an interview protocol. They learn about all other information that they will need when interviewing people in the context of being a journalist. It's the same, exactly the same process for every single student. The process doesn't change at all. The student doesn't really need to know about the ethics approval process that happens behind the scenes. It is more important for the students, second year undergraduate journalism students, to learn about the process of conducting an interview. So the unit coordinator takes on the role of ensuring that ethics is adhered to and that the approvals are undertaken. It's important to note that this is not research, that it's not going to be disseminated as research, that the findings stay within the university. And so we've got slightly different considerations, even though we're involved with speaking to members of the public, and we need to ensure that when we go through the process of speaking to members of the public, we adhere to the national standard. So that's a great example of how we use this expedited process for an undergraduate coursework unit on the basis of a whole unit, rather than by individual applications from students. The benefit, of course, is that the number of applications that the HREC has to consider is by the number of units rather than the number of students, which could be in the hundreds.
Thanks, Celeste. The other approach that we've developed is an expedited, what we refer to as a coursework approval. This process really is very similar to what we would have for our typical low to negligible risk applications, with a few exceptions. And the first is that it's a paper-based process. Now, the reason for that is our online ethics submission system is not accessible by undergraduate students. And so we've developed an information package that will go out to unit coordinators who have students that might be in need of using this process, and it contains the relevant application forms along with some exemplars, information sheets along with, again, exemplars, consent exemplars, and so on. So all of the information that's really needed to upskill those students, and in some cases provide an easy approach for the supervising teaching academics to be able to prepare and submit a good quality ethics application. So the process is essentially that the student, with the guidance of their supervisor or student groups in some cases, submit the application form for approval along with all of the other relevant documentation. So information sheets, consent forms, relevant approvals from organisations, copies of recruitment strategies, those kinds of things. And the application is subsequently set to one member of the low to negligible risk reviewer pool, and it's also reviewed by one member of our HREC admin team, our ethics coordinator or ethics officer. And the typical turnaround time for these is down to about 7 days in terms of providing outcomes back to students. So what I think is important to note, first of all, about this, and this connects with Wednesday's plenary by Professor Ian Kerridge when he talked about science at warp speed, is that the academic integrity aspect of this and the rigor of reviews not compromised in any way. We're simply providing a solution to a problem that fits with the need for a rapid turnaround in coursework approvals. But where applications are incomplete, where we need some information, where things are not adequately explained about the conduct of the research, or they don't meet the criteria for low to negligible risk, They're returned to the student and supervisor with feedback, which needs to be attended to and resubmitted, or it's escalated to the full committee as required. So the ideal example of this, I guess, is for the honours courses here at Central University. So irrespective of whether it's an embedded honours, as in the case of our 4-year degrees in, say, physiotherapy or podiatry, or it's our 1-year standalone courses, for example, as the Bachelor of Science honours or the psychology honours, where the students undertake a relatively small but standalone research projects that's guided by academics in these capstone units, although sometimes in the honours or in the masters by coursework, they're across 2 terms of enrolment, so arguably they have a little bit more time. But it's a genuine, we'll call it legitimate research project where students are recruiting participants, they're capturing data, they're doing the data analysis, they'll submit a thesis, they'll do some kind of presentation that's linked to assessments for that degree, but often they'll go on to publish their findings in the peer-reviewed literature. So I guess one way of looking at this process is that, yes, it does increase the workload for the HREC team, for our HREC coordinator and HREC officer. And I guess to give you some idea of the number of applications that we typically see, in 2018, we had 87 approvals via this process. That increased to 91 in 2019. It went up to 123 in 2020, and year to date, we've got 108, which are mostly from the honours courses, or from students and projects where that first option might not have applied. But despite that increase in workload potentially, there is some really clear and significant benefits, we think, to students and to the teaching academics. Firstly, it ensures that we remain adherent to the national statement, and it exposes the students, and for some less experienced teaching academics, to the principles and values underpinned by the national statement. And one of those, of course, is that there's an overarching governance around how research is conducted, including the consideration of the respects that participants should be afforded when participating in a research project. The second is that it supports a rapid but rigorous review process that minimises additional burden on a large number of our low-risk reviewer pool, and it allows those teaching academics to meet industry demands or meet external accreditation requirements in those coursework units. So we maximise graduate preparedness and support authentic assessment in those units. And finally, and critically for Celeste and myself, and for our institution more broadly, it promotes a really strong culture of academic integrity amongst both the student and staff cohorts, and a great depth, I guess, of critical thinking skills for our graduates. And so taken together, these processes, we think, have been well worth the investment of time and resources. They've helped foster what we think is a greater degree of trust with academics, where they really genuinely appreciate that we're all on the same page in terms of encouraging ethically just research. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Celeste and Rob. That was an excellent primer. Really good advice to follow for student research projects. We have a few minutes, so I'm going to add a bit of a coda to that. When I was with the North Coast Medical Education Collaboration, we embedded students from city medical schools here in the North Coast for a year. And part of that year, they had to do research projects. As you started out pointing out, there's a struggle between getting the timeline of approval in with the timeline of academic calendar. We put in 3 simple fixes that solved that problem or alleviated it greatly. One, we had students start thinking about a research project the year before they came to us. 2, we had a blanket research approval, ethics approval, not with the details of individual projects, but that could be fleshed out with individual projects so that the HRECs were accustomed to seeing these. And 3, I maintained a list of projects that were ongoing at the hospitals and at the public health units in our area, and from which individual portions could be hived off for individual students. And so students could select from them if they didn't have their own idea. And that allowed us to get a year research project completed by students in the year that they were with us. Okay, I'm going to go.